You didn't fail because you lacked effort. You failed because you had too much of it. There is a point where the mind stops pushing, and reality begins to move. That point is not where you were taught to arrive. My name is Daniel, and what I'm going to dismantle here is not a belief. It's a mechanism. It works like structure. It has logic, weight, and a point of entry, and that point changes everything when you finally see it. Not as an idea, as a direct perception of what was operating without your awareness. So before anything else, I need you to understand why effort, not laziness, not lack of faith, not lack of method, is what is blocking what you want to create. And for that, I need to show how the mind works when it's trying. Because that's where the problem begins. That's where the mechanism inverts. That's where most people spend years without realizing they're pedaling in reverse, thinking they're moving forward. The human mind operates in layers. Most people live permanently in the most superficial layer, the layer of conscious effort, declared intention, will projected toward the future. That layer has a simple name, tension. Not necessarily muscular tension, cognitive tension. A permanent orientation of attention toward what doesn't yet exist. A constant vigilance over the current state compared to the desired state. It's the mind that never stops measuring the distance between where you are and where you want to arrive. And here is the invisible mechanism that almost nobody explains with this precision. When you keep the mind in a state of tension oriented toward a goal, you are simultaneously, structurally, without realizing it, encoding the absence of that goal as present reality. The brain doesn't process intention without processing context. And the context you deliver unconsciously, repeatedly, is one of lack, of waiting, of distance. This is not philosophy. This is how neural networks function. The mind that wants with urgency is, in the same movement, registering that what is wanted hasn't arrived yet. And that registration, not the intention, but the state in which the intention occurs, is the signal that determines what the system produces. Think with me for a second. When you sleep, you don't try to sleep. You let go. And at the exact moment you truly let go, not pretending to let go, not practicing letting go, but genuinely surrendering control, sleep happens. Automatically, effortlessly, as if it were already waiting. Now think about what happens when you can't sleep. You're lying down, body tired, and the mind is monitoring, checking whether you've fallen asleep yet, evaluating the quality of the sleep that hasn't come, calculating how many hours are left, asking why it still hasn't worked. The mind in a state of monitoring creates, by definition, the opposite of what it seeks. It's not a character flaw. It's a property of the system. And what you do with manifestation, with creation, with changing reality, is exactly the same mechanism. You monitor. You evaluate. You check whether it has worked yet. And in that constant monitoring, you are coding repeatedly in the deepest structure of your perception that the result hasn't arrived yet. The mind doesn't separate intention from context. It registers the state you are in while thinking about what you want. And the state most people are in while thinking about what they want is lack, distance, waiting. That is the signal that goes to the system. Not the declared intention. The real state. Let me tell you about Kaio. Kaio was 31 years old and worked as a data analyst at a mid-sized company. He wasn't the kind of person who talked about spirituality. He was skeptical by training, analytical by temperament. But for 2 years he had been trying, with method and discipline, to build his own consulting firm. He had spreadsheets. He had projections. He had a notebook where he reviewed his goals every Monday morning. Every week he identified what he had done, what was missing, what needed to be different. One evening, after a meeting that hadn't gone as expected, He sat in his office chair after everyone had left. He wasn't thinking about the project. He was simply staring at the dark computer screen with a pen resting still between his fingers, doing nothing. He stayed like that for about 10 minutes. And in that silence, without intention, without a plan, without reviewing anything, he noticed something that 2 years of planning had never shown him. He had been treating the consulting firm as a problem that needed constant solving. And problems that need constant solving demand constant attention. And constant attention keeps the problem, and the distance to the solution, permanently alive at the center of the mind. It wasn't a dramatic revelation. It was a simple perception. 6 weeks later, without changing a single step of the plan, his first client arrived through a contact he had made 2 years earlier and had considered closed. Nothing external had changed. The signal he was emitting had. What Caio touched in that moment has a technical name in cognitive neuroscience. Default mode network active without task orientation. It's the state the brain enters when you're not trying to solve anything. When attention isn't fixed on a goal. When there's no active monitoring. And it's precisely in this state that the most complex connections emerge. The solutions that analytical thinking couldn't reach. The patterns that were invisible while you were looking directly at them. This is not a metaphor. It's how cognition works. The problem is that this state is unstable for most people. The mind trained for constant effort treats any pause as a threat, as negligence, as disguised laziness. And so it immediately returns to monitoring, planning, controlling, and dissolves exactly the state it would need to sustain in order to produce the perception it's seeking. The vacuum is not the absence of thought. It's the absence of oriented tension. It's the difference between a mind that thinks and a mind that pushes. You can think without pushing. You can have clarity without tension. You can know what you want without being permanently pointed toward what is missing. But to enter this state consistently, not by accident as Caio did that night, you need to understand what prevents it. And what prevents it is always the same thing, appearing in different forms. It's the identity that tries. I want to be precise about what I'm calling identity here, because that word becomes vague when used carelessly. Identity, in this context, is the set of beliefs you hold about who you are in relation to what you want. Not the conscious beliefs you would declare if someone asked. The operational beliefs, the ones that determine how you behave, what you notice, what you ignore, how you interpret what happens. Most people who are trying to create something new have an identity I call the effort identity. This identity has very specific characteristics. First, it believes that results are proportional to effort applied. That more tension generates more results. That stopping is regressing. That rest needs to be justified by prior performance. Second, it interprets the absence of results as the absence of sufficient effort. So when something doesn't happen, the automatic response is to try harder. Not to try differently, not to stop trying, but to try with more force, more frequency, more intensity. Third, and this is the most important, it defines the self as someone who hasn't arrived yet. And it defines not having arrived yet as a permanent state that can only be resolved by arriving, which never fully happens. Because the effort identity needs the goal at a distance in order to continue existing. That is the central paradox. The identity that tries to create also needs the absence of what it tries to create. Because without that absence, there is no reason for the effort. And without the effort, the identity dissolves. So unconsciously, structurally, the effort identity sabotages the result. Not through emotional self-sabotage, but through systemic coherence. It is being faithful to itself. I need you to let that idea settle for a moment before continuing. Because the immediate impulse of the mind trained in effort is to transform what I just said into another tool. I understand. So I need to get rid of the effort identity. How do I do that? And there it is, the effort has been redirected toward the elimination of effort. The mechanism stays the same. That's not how it works. The way out is not to fight the effort identity. It's to understand it with such clarity that it loses the ability to operate in the dark. Because it operates in the dark. It functions below the level of conscious intention. And the only movement that genuinely alters a pattern operating below consciousness is bringing that pattern into consciousness. Not to correct it, but to see it. Seeing is different from resolving. When you see with clarity the mechanism that was operating, something happens that has no equivalent in the logic of effort. The mind stops. Not because you told it to stop, because it recognizes that the map it was using doesn't correspond to the territory. And in that recognition, in that moment of suspension between the old map and the new, is where the vacuum appears. Vacuum is not emptiness in the sense of absence of content. It's the absence of forced direction. Think of a completely silent room. The silence is not the absence of air. It's the absence of noise. You're still breathing. Your heart is still beating. The room still exists with all its structure. But the noise that was preventing fine perception has disappeared. The neutral point is that for the mind still functions. Thought still occurs. But oriented tension, the constant pushing toward what is missing, is absent. And in that absence, perception becomes extraordinarily precise. You begin to notice connections that the noise of effort was covering. You begin to see patterns that were available all along, but invisible because attention was saturated with monitoring. And here is something people generally don't expect. Decisions made from the vacuum have a different quality. Not necessarily more creative, not more elaborate, but more coherent. Coherent with who you actually are, with what actually makes sense in the context of your entire life, not just with what the effort identity decided it wants this week. Coherence is the word that matters here. It's not enthusiasm, not certainty, not the absence of doubt. Coherence is when the internal state and the external state are not at war. When what you communicate with your entire being, not just with your declared intentions, but with your physiology, with your attention, with your unconscious choices, is aligned with what you want to create. And coherence cannot be manufactured by effort. It emerges when effort ceases. Let me go deeper into the mechanism, because this is where most explanations on this subject stay superficial. When you are in a state of oriented tension, the default state of the effort identity, your nervous system is in a mode of cognitive vigilance. Attention is narrow, focused, actively monitoring the distance between the current and desired state. In this mode, the brain has reduced capacity to process signals from the environment that aren't directly related to the monitored goal. This is efficient when the problem is technical and linear. It's catastrophic when what you need is to perceive complex patterns, non-obvious connections, opportunities that arrive in unexpected forms. Most real-life changes are not linear. They don't follow the path you planned. They arrive from angles you didn't anticipate, through people you weren't expecting, at moments that aren't part of the plan. And the system in constant vigilance, focused on the path it mapped out, simply doesn't register those signals. Not because it's unintelligent, because it's too busy monitoring what it decided matters. The neutral field, the absence of oriented tension, opens the perceptual field. Attention becomes diffuse in the good sense. Not distracted, but open, capable of registering what is present, not just what was anticipated. And it's in that openness that what you might call synchronicity happens. Not as a mysterious phenomenon, as a direct result of a perceptual system that is finally receiving the totality of available signal, instead of filtering out everything that doesn't fit the model it built. This changes the fundamental question. The question the effort identity asks is, what do I need to do to get there? The question that emerges from the vacuum is, what is available now that I wasn't perceiving? These are two completely different cognitive orientations, and they generate completely different results. The first orientation keeps you in the future, in what doesn't yet exist, in what is missing, and while your attention is on what is missing, your entire system is processing reality from the state of lack. The second orientation brings you to the present, not as a spiritual practice of presence, as a practical cognitive operation. You are genuinely asking what is available now, and that requires attention to be here, not projected into some desired future. And when you stop being oriented toward what is missing and begin to perceive what is present, the distance between the current and desired state begins to collapse. Not because you did something to reduce it, but because the distance was largely a construction of the mind in vigilance mode, and without vigilance mode sustaining that construction, it loses consistency. The reality you experience is not objective reality. It is reality filtered by attention, interpreted through operational beliefs, colored by the current emotional state. Two people in the same objective situation can be in radically different subjective realities, and both are correct about what they perceive because they are perceiving from different places. The effort identity perceives from a specific place, the place of distance. And from there, the distance is always real, always large, always demanding more effort to cross. The neutral point perceives from a different place, a place without a fixed position. And from there, distance is not a characteristic of reality. It's an interpretation, a construction, and constructions can be undone not by opposing effort, but by the suspension of the effort that maintains them. I'm now going to talk about something you'll probably want to immediately turn into a technique. I'm going to ask you to resist that impulse while you listen. How you enter the vacuum, not as a practice, as understanding, because practicing the vacuum is another way of trying to get there. And arriving at the vacuum by trying is like trying to relax by force. The effort cancels the result. The vacuum is not reached. It is revealed. And it is revealed when what covers it is removed. So the correct question is not how do I enter the vacuum? It's what is preventing me from being in the vacuum right now. The answer will always be some variation of the same thing. A belief about what needs to happen before you can relax, a story about why effort is necessary, an identity that needs the result at a distance to justify its own existence. And the removal of these coverings doesn't happen through the effort of removing them. It happens through precise observation of them. Observation, not analysis, not resolution. Observation. There is a fundamental difference between observing a thought and being inside a thought. When you are inside a thought, it seems like reality. It seems like an objective description of the world. It seems like undeniable truth. When you observe a thought, when you notice that you are having this thought right now, something changes. The thought doesn't necessarily disappear, but it loses the ability to operate as unquestioned reality. It becomes visible as a construction, and visible constructions don't have the same power as invisible ones. That is the central movement of everything I'm describing. It's not a movement of addition, adding a new belief, a new technique, a new state. It's a movement of subtraction, of gradual removal of what is covering the neutral field that already exists beneath all mental activity. The words already exists are important. The neutral point, the absence of oriented tension, the neutral field is not a state you need to build. It's not an achievement. It's not the result of years of practice or a specific level of development. It is already present. Now, beneath all thoughts, beneath all stories, beneath all the activity of the mind that tries, plans, monitors, evaluates, the absolute silence that exists beneath the noise doesn't need to be created. The noise is what was added, and this changes everything about how you relate to the process. If the vacuum is something you need to reach, you'll try to reach it, and the effort of reaching will keep the distance alive. If the vacuum is something that is already present and that you need to stop covering, the movement is different. It's a movement of allowing, of releasing, of reducing the activity that obscures it, not by the force of reduction, but by the understanding that the activity is unnecessary. And when you genuinely understand that an activity is unnecessary, not when you intellectually agree that it isn't, but when you truly see its unnecessariness, it ceases on its own. Not because you forced it to cease, because the belief that sustained it was exposed as a construction. Let me now introduce the difference between state and strategy, because it is the axis of everything. Most approaches to manifestation, to change, to creating reality work at the level of strategy. What you should do, how you should think, which affirmations you should repeat, which visualizations you should practice. All of these are strategies, and strategies operate above the state. The problem is that state determines the effectiveness of the strategy. The same affirmation, practiced from two different states, produces radically different results. The same visualization, executed from a state of lack or a state of wholeness, creates opposite realities. State is not mood, not a temporary disposition. It is the base condition from which you process reality. It is the soil, and what you plant in the soil depends on the quality of the soil, regardless of which seed it is. The effort identity operates from a base state I call deficit orientation. It's a state where the system is permanently calibrated toward distance, toward what is missing, toward what hasn't arrived yet, toward the gap between the current and the desired. The vacuum is not a state of abundance orientation, as many people would say. That would simply be inverting the orientation, keeping the comparison structure active. The vacuum is the absence of compulsory orientation. It's the state where the system is not permanently comparing the current to the desired. Not because it has no preferences, having preferences is simply how minds work. But the preferences exist without creating tension, without generating the constant signal of lack, without keeping the system in vigilance. And in that state, something that seems like a paradox but is simply mechanics, the system begins to perceive and create opportunities aligned with the preferences, not because it is forcing the creation, but because it is no longer blocking perception with the noise of monitoring. I need to speak about identity collapse with more precision now, because this is probably the most misunderstood point of this entire mechanism. When I talk about identity collapse, I'm not talking about the destruction of the self. It's not mystical dissolution. It's a much more specific process and, in practice, far less dramatic than it sounds. Belief systems tend toward internal coherence. The mind doesn't like contradiction. When you hold an operational belief that results depend on constant effort, and you begin to stop efforting, the mind generates discomfort, not because stopping is genuinely dangerous, but because it's incoherent with the identity. That discomfort is frequently interpreted as confirmation that the effort was necessary, and the effort is resumed. What I'm calling identity collapse is simply the process by which the effort identity loses its appearance of necessity. It's not destroyed. It's not immediately replaced by another. It simply stops operating as unquestioned reality and begins operating as one option among others. When the effort identity is an option rather than an invisible obligation, you can choose not to enter it. Not because you fought against it, but because you saw it with enough clarity to recognize that it is a choice, that it always was a choice even if it never seemed like one. That is the collapse. Not dramatic, not necessarily painful, but deeply disorienting because it removes a structure that organized your relationship with time, with effort, with the future. And in the disorientation that follows, in the space between the old identity and no new identity, is where perception becomes cleaner than it has ever been. I want to name something that will arise when you begin working with this, because if I don't name it, it will seem like you're doing something wrong. The fear of the vacuum. It's not a fear of nothing. It's a very specific fear. The fear that if you stop trying, nothing will happen. That if you release control, everything will fall apart. That if you're not constantly monitoring, you'll miss something important. This fear has a name in cognitive psychology: inflated agency belief. The belief that results depend primarily on your active control, that without your effort, circumstances will freeze. It's a rational fear within the system of the effort identity. It makes complete sense inside that model. If effort is what creates, stopping effort is stopping creation. But when you observe your own life honestly, you notice something unsettling. The best things that happened to you were rarely the result of maximum control. The most important connections, the most transformative opportunities, the moments that genuinely changed the trajectory, how many of them were in your plan? I'm not saying planning has no value. I'm saying that planning and compulsive control are different things. And confusing the two is one of the most costly mistakes the effort identity makes. Let me now introduce the distinction between oriented action and reactive action, because this is where everything touches the concrete world. Oriented action emerges from the neutral point. It's action that arises from clear perception of what is present, what is available, what makes sense in the full context of your life at this moment. It has a particular quality. It's not forced. It doesn't generate internal resistance. When you are about to take an action that is truly oriented from the vacuum, there is no feeling of having to do something. There is simply the clarity that this is the next thing. Reactive action is what the effort identity produces. It's action that arises from constant monitoring of distance. Every movement is a reaction to the gap between the current and desired state. It's always slightly urgent, always carries a tone of compensation, always carries the feeling that it's still not enough. Both can look the same from the outside. Two people can execute the same task, one from the vacuum, one from effort. Externally, the behavior can be identical. Internally, the difference is total, and the results over time are radically different. Not because action oriented from the vacuum is magically more effective, but because the quality of perception that generated it is different. The decision that arises from a system without the noise of vigilance is more precise, more coherent with the totality of the context, less distorted by the filter of urgency, and more precise decisions generate more consistent results. There's nothing mystical about it. It's simply what happens when you improve the quality of the input signal to a decision system. The result is not the goal of the vacuum. I'll say that again because the mind that tries will want to discard that sentence. The vacuum is not a more sophisticated strategy for getting what you want faster. It's not a manifestation technique with a better success rate. It's not a shortcut to arrival. The vacuum is simply the recognition that the state of constant vigilance was not necessary, and that living in it came at a cost that was never consciously negotiated. The result, when it comes, is almost a byproduct. a natural consequence of a system operating with coherence, with expanded perception, with action that arises from clarity rather than urgency. But if you use the vacuum as another technique for reaching the result, you are reintroducing deficit orientation through the back door. You are saying implicitly, I'll do this the calm way now because I found out it works better for getting where I want. And that is not the vacuum. That is the effort identity with a new strategy. I need to distinguish vacuum from resignation now because the confusion between the two is where many people stop, not from lack of understanding, but from lack of precision about what they are feeling. Resignation is a state where the system abandons intention because it has concluded there is no path. It's giving up accompanied by defeat. It's the mind that says it's not going to happen and closes the field of possibilities. The vacuum is structurally opposite. At the neutral point, possibilities are open, not despite intention, but because of the absence of the tension that would close the perceptual field. It's the mind that is not concluding anything. That is neither affirming it will happen nor concluding it won't. That is simply present with clear preferences, without urgency about the result. The difference is felt physically if you pay attention. Resignation has a quality of collapse, of weight, of closing. The field of possibilities narrows. The neutral point has a quality of openness, of lightness, not euphoria, lightness. The field of possibilities expands, not because you decreed it would expand, but because the noise that was narrowing it has been reduced. If what you are feeling resembles defeated surrender, it is not the vacuum. It's another state that can resemble the vacuum from the outside but has a completely different internal quality. People who confuse the two generally oscillate between maximum effort and total resignation, and neither is the neutral point. It's possible to oscillate between those two poles for years without ever touching the state I'm talking about. There is a question that emerges naturally here and that I want to address directly. How do you know you're in the vacuum? There is no spectacular sensation associated with it. No unmistakable sign. No experience that shouts you've arrived. What exists is an absence, a lightness, a sense that there is no urgency behind the next movement. A quality of attention that is present without being compulsively pointed in any direction. And sometimes, the most reliable indication is retrospective. You look at how the last hour passed and realize you weren't monitoring anything. You weren't checking whether you were arriving. You were simply present with what was there. It's not glamorous. It doesn't have the texture of a spiritual revelation. It's far more prosaic, and that's precisely why it's real and sustainable, rather than being a peak experience that doesn't repeat. The vacuum is not a permanent state to be reached and sustained indefinitely. It's not the final goal. It's not where you'll live forever after understanding all of this. It's a reference point, a point to which you return when you notice that effort has come back. When you notice that vigilance has reinstalled itself. When you notice that the effort identity has assumed control again without you realizing. And it will assume control, repeatedly, because it has years of practice, because it's reinforced by culture, by family, by the work environment, by practically every system in which you operate. What changes over time is not that effort never returns. It's the speed with which you notice it has returned, and the ease with which you can return to the neutral point when you notice. At first, it might take days to realize you've slipped back into compulsory vigilance. Over time, you notice in hours, then in minutes, and eventually the recognition happens almost simultaneously with the slip, and the return is immediate, almost effortless. That is the practical development of this work. Not building a permanent state of peace. Developing the capacity to notice the departure and return. not with guilt or with more corrective effort, but simply with the clear recognition that the map had confused itself with the territory once again. The language you use internally is one of the most powerful mechanisms for maintaining state. The effort identity has a specific vocabulary. Words like still, but, when, if I manage, after. These are temporal connectives that keep the present suspended in relation to the future. When this happens, I'll be fine. After this changes, I'll be able to relax. I'm still not where I need to be. Each of these constructions is a confirmation of deficit, a declaration to the system that the current state is insufficient, and that sufficiency is somewhere in the future, conditioned on external results. And the system believes it, because the system doesn't distinguish between narration and reality. What the mind says about what is happening is treated as a description of what is happening. The change in internal language is not positive affirmation. It's not replacing "I haven't arrived yet" with "I've already arrived." That would just be another story, opposite in content but identical in structure. It's something more subtle, a growing tendency to observe the story instead of inhabiting it. I am having the thought that I haven't arrived yet, instead of I haven't arrived yet. It seems small. It's fundamental, because an observed thought doesn't have the same power as an inhabited thought. And language that includes the perception of the process. I'm noticing, I'm perceiving, there's a thought that says, maintains a degree of distance from the story that prevents the story from becoming unquestioned reality. The mechanism of creation, whatever you choose to call it, is not a mechanism of addition. It doesn't work by summing intention, effort, technique, visualization until the result appears. It's a mechanism of removal. The result you seek is generally not blocked by the absence of something. It's blocked by the presence of something you don't see as a blockage, because it looks like virtue, like dedication, like correct effort. The identity that tries, that monitors, that keeps the deficit alive as a permanent state. That is the structure standing in front. And it cannot be removed by trying harder. It can only be exposed through observation. And as it is exposed, it loses density, loses power, begins to dissolve. What remains when it dissolves is not emptiness. It's coherence. A system that knows what it wants without needing to maintain wanting as constant urgency. That acts with clarity without needing urgency as the engine. That perceives what is present without being saturated by what should be present and hasn't arrived yet. That system creates, not by force, by coherence. And coherence is not something you build. It's what appears when you stop actively building its opposite. The null state emerged from the need to go beyond traditional manifestation techniques. It was created to help you understand and sustain that internal point of neutrality where effort disappears and reality begins to respond coherently. More than learning something new, it's a process of dismantling the identity that forces, allowing change to happen through alignment rather than tension. It's not mandatory. It's for those who feel it makes sense. It's a continuation of this internal investigation, for those who want to go deeper into the mechanism, not just understand it, but learn to inhabit it consistently. The link is in the pinned comment. If something in this reasoning touched something you had already perceived but couldn't name, leave in the comments your name and one word that describes what you are feeling right now. It can be silence, neutrality, coherence, surrender, confusion, clarity. Any word that is honest about where you are in this moment. Because the most precise starting point for this work is not where you would like to be. It is exactly where you are now.